over the past 2 decades, Europe has sort of felt like they've kind of lost control. They've lost control of their digital ecosystem. There's a sense of losing control on economic considerations.
And right now, the governance model that we have, because all of these infrastructural systems are captured primarily by monopolies, in the best cases by duopolies, is an entirely autocratic system. If your entire infrastructural stack is under autocratic governance, your society becomes autocratic itself.
This is Chloe Teevan, and this is Europolis, the Global Europe podcast. Recent months have seen a growing focus in Europe, but also across the world, on the concept of tech sovereignty, following the publication of the Draghi report that highlighted just how far behind Europe was falling in the area of digital technologies. I'm joined by Gautam Kamath, ECDPM digital expert and co-author, together with Raphael Pouillet and myself, of the recent report From India Stack to Eurostack, Reconciling Approaches to Digital Sovereign Infrastructure. In today's episode, Gautam speaks with Robin Berjon, one of the major thinkers today, speaking about technology sovereignty and the tech stack. So Gautam, why did you think that Robin Berjon would be an interesting guest to start this series on digital policy and digital partnerships?
Robin is actually a really interesting guy. He's a French-Australian technologist. He currently serves as a deputy director of the IPFS Foundation, and he was playing a leading role on global governance discussions for almost more than a decade. It's really a timely moment now, because over the past 2 decades, Europe has sort of felt like they've kind of lost control. They've lost control of their digital ecosystem. There's a sense of losing control on economic considerations. There's a sense that in the technology world, Europe's innovation is lagging, and so to try to address all of these questions, I think it's really important that Europe is able to leverage its partnerships globally and try to see how they can learn from others. And so, without further ado, we should jump right into his interview and hear about his thoughts on digital sovereignty and how we can architect our own sort of digital futures. So it's a privilege to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Why should we all worry about, let's say, digital sovereignty? Why should we worry about control? What does digital sovereignty really mean? This is obviously very thorny and timely and important question, and it's an old question. Many people have different answers to this question. So I would love to get your take on sort of what is the rationale behind why policymakers should think about digital infrastructure in a certain way.
Right. So just to be clear, this is an 8-hour-long podcast, right? I can. So to try to fit it into a slightly shorter time. Yeah. There are many layers to this, but I think perhaps the shortest way to get to that answer is that power in technology comes from operating infrastructures. And basically, when you run digital infrastructure, you gain structural power over the users of that infrastructure. And it's important to understand that, because when we think of infrastructure, we tend to think of like dams, railroads, electrical grids, like these massive things that you can touch or see in the landscape. In the digital space, of course, you can't see them. And people tend to like default to this view of like, oh, infrastructure, it must mean connectivity and cloud, and that's it, right? But really, infrastructure is anything that is hard to replace. And that can be because it requires massive investment, but it can also be because of network effects, for instance. So with any kind of two-sided market that happens, that has broad downstream impact on its users. And that is important because if you create a system that's only for one type of users, those users tend to like have the ability to push back because they can be coherent, right? If it's only for doctors, then doctors will have the power to organize. But if it's for like every generic, then it's a much harder collective action problem for the users to push back. And third, infrastructure is something that sets rules for its users. So if you have these three things, you have infrastructure, and that means that everything from, of course, cloud, but also advertising, search, social, browsers, operating systems, etc., are all infrastructure. And given that the internet is, operating basically at the heart of everything, they're the infrastructure of infrastructure. So that gives you a lot of power. Now, power isn't necessarily bad. You can use it for all kinds of things. Power is how you get work done, right? Sure. But there's the question of how that power gets governed. And so once that power has been acquired by these actors, the question of like what the governance model of those infrastructure structures is comes to the front. And right now, the governance model that we have, because all of these infrastructural systems are captured primarily by monopolies, in the best cases by duopolies, is an entirely autocratic system.
Good.
And the problem is because this infrastructural power sets the rules for how people who use it operate, it governs the people who use it, essentially, then that autocratic power seeps across all of society. Right. And so if your entire infrastructural stack is under autocratic governance, your society becomes autocratic itself. Right. And this power, the rules that are set in digital are encroaching on rules set by states. Right. Very much so. In some cases, like for some businesses, if you're a publisher, really the laws set by the digital monopolies are more important to you than whatever laws set by any state around the world might be. And so this immediately creates problems of sovereignty, and problems of sovereignty not because you want to be necessarily statist or state-centrist, but like even from the perspective of a society, any group, any collective loses its self-governance, its self-determination power to these monopolies.
On the one hand, you have this sort of in the last decade or decade and a half, this power dynamic that has been shifted in the world of internet governance, for example, where states sort of control and have much more say in how the standards are set, or large companies are able to influence the standards development process. They're able to have a lot more sort of control than these decentralized multi-stakeholder approaches. So I guess coming back to the question of sovereignty, is this sovereignty a sort of reflection of the lack of democracy and sort of the autocracy, if you will, that you were referring to? Or is it just a function of markets and scale and having, the benefits of innovation, or having sort of being in a stage of development where the critical points of control have already been captured by winners? Is that where we are? Like, what's sort of your assessment on what's the state of the world at the moment? Like, is there hope? Is there a way for this statist approach to be stopped?
I mean, I think things are particularly bad, and I'm particularly hopeful at the same time. I think both are absolutely true. I would say things are particularly bad because of the degree of capture that has taken place. And so in the digital world, power really comes from controlling architectural points of control, right? And so that means that, for instance, if you control the way in which revenue flows to a system, then you control that system. If you control the defaults for that system, then you're going to have a huge amount of influence over how it works, etc. Right? So that's where power comes from in the digital space. And like most of those, all the primary points of control have been like captured by a tiny number of actors, right? And so this results in a high concentration of power. And the thing that constantly drives me crazy is that when you listen to policymakers, they all say like innovation, innovation, innovation. The problem is not innovation. If Elon Musk owns all the roads in your country and uses that to levy taxes on, tourism and transport, etc., you can give as much money as you want to a lab to come up with a better road with like the best asphalt in the world and like, I don't know, the best road signs, and you'll have your lab with like, it's like 20 meters of like amazing road, but then you still don't own any of the roads, right? And so these monopolies were not made by innovation, and they will not be broken by innovation. what we need to do is to intervene at that level, at that infrastructural level, to liberate those control points so that they can be governed openly. And so the reason that I'm hopeful is because I think a growing number of people are understanding that. I think that the monopolies have reached sort of like the end of their rope in terms of like trying to squeeze as much as possible out of the system. And even people who normally don't care about tech policy are really fed up with like their search engine being terrible, their operating system is not changing for 10 years, even though they pay hundreds of euros. You know, everything's becoming bad to the point that it's impossible to miss. And so I think there's a strong desire to like really fix this problem. That's why I think we can do it.
No, and I absolutely sort of agree in the sense that there is a lot of concern in policymakers across the world. There's a reason why the DMA, for example, existed. It's because it's a policymaker response to the concern of this concentration of power.
Right.
I guess this discussion also reminds me of Lawrence Lessig's theories, because it's best captured by this sort of pathetic dot that we are, and these four forces that are sort of exerting on us. And just to come back to this idea of we can code our sort of future and we can code our destiny, the Indians seem to have sort of created an approach, let's say, which targets a certain part of the stack. Before we go into the sort of Indian example, I would love to get your explanation of the stack. I mean, we've worked on trying to sort of depict what this is and try to come up with layers. But if you could just run us through what is the technology stack, and then also what is the sort of Indian example and how does that fit in?
Sure. So I think the first thing to understand about the stack is that we always represent it as a stack to people to simplify it conceptually, but in truth, it's not really a stack. It's more of a forest of dependencies. But like in keeping with the idea of simplification, the idea of stack is that something is above something else if it depends on it, right? And so the question is like let's say you're a small innovative startup, and you want to ship a product, a consumer product. You're going to have to rely on a whole number of inputs to produce that product, right? And those inputs include things like an operating system, probably several, probably a browser as well, depending on what your distribution channels are. If you're shipping to mobile devices, you're going to have to go through app stores. And so right there's a dependency on the app store, which means that you're going to be taxed. 30% of your revenue from that will go to someone else, right? If you're shipping online, the odds are you'll need advertising, and therefore advertising is also an input. It's an infrastructure for you, right? And again, in advertising, you're going to be taxed by the monopolies that operate it to the tune of like 30 to 80%. No one really knows, actually. There's just huge taxation there as well. You're going to need cloud because your services have to be online, and you're going to need to be found. So you need to be present in search, which often means that you need to pay to advertise in search to be found. You're going to need to be in social to be discovered. If you're a publisher, it's even worse because your content needs to be discovered, etc., etc. So all of these things come together to form a stack in that they rely on one another, right? And so if you rely on advertising for your revenue, advertising systems then rely on the cloud to operate, which then relies on some data centers, which needs connectivity and needs revenues, electricity, everything, right? So you can see this chain of the dependencies from the top level product all the way down, and because it's a chain of dependencies, if you control one of those dependencies, then you control everything above it. Not necessarily directly. So, for instance, if you control cloud, you don't necessarily control everything all the way up, but you influence it. And of course, where there's the most influence is actually often higher up in the stack because that's where there's more value. And so if you control app stores and advertising, for instance, or search and social for discoverable things, then that's where you're going to extract as much value as possible.
You could argue that policymakers in the past have sort of focused on the lower levels of the stack, to a large extent, focusing on infrastructure investments, the CHIPS Act, for example, or things like that. And I think what you're trying to say, I guess, which is super important, is policymakers do need to focus on places where the value is generated. And where the choke points are.
Absolutely. And it's not that we shouldn't focus on the lower levels too, right? If we can't get chips, it's not great either. But yes, one thing that worries me with the current policymaking environment is the extreme focus on AI. It's not that AI is unimportant, it is, but it's maybe 5-10% of the whole problem. Is definitely not 5-10% of the value that even expected over a long period of time. And I don't understand what go-to-market model they have in mind, because if you focus everything on AI and you get this amazing AI pipeline, which we should absolutely have an Airbus for AI. There's a real model there. But if that's all you do, you end up with these products that, again, are going to have to give 30% of their revenue to app stores and 50% of their revenues to ad tech, and are going to have to pay through the nose for whatever cloud, and won't be found in search, and won't have distribution channels that matter where people use them in, again, search browsers, operating systems, etc. And so if we focus all that money on that narrow thing without solving the ecosystem around it, the stack, then we're just like giving money. We're eventually just subsidizing big tech again, right? And I don't think that's a win.
But so I guess just to sort of push back on this notion a bit, because there is a lot of sort of benefits of scale. There's a trade-off that you sort of have on innovation and being small, for example. And so I guess sort of the counter argument to this is that there aren't enough sort of decentralized solutions. Maybe there isn't enough capacity. Maybe there aren't enough, let's say, European alternatives for those critical parts of the layers, like cloud or like platforms, for example. And then I guess the question is, should we sort of try to replicate what's there, or should we try to influence the governance model so that these platforms can be sort of checked a little bit? Or is the solution more about coding the infrastructure differently in some sense?
This is a terrible answer, but all of the above. So one thing that is clear to me is that there is zero value in trying to replicate what exists in the Silicon Valley. Even if we succeeded, which we probably wouldn't, but if we succeeded, we would just turn, problems created by foreign companies into problems created by European companies, because we'd have the exact same problems. It actually might be worse, because they would have greater power to capture local regulators, because they'd be local, right? So I really don't think that's the way forward. I think a lot of the time the solution lies in breaking the problem down into its components and figuring out how to rebuild it as governed infrastructure. And that's often a lot easier than maybe that sentence made it sound like, right? So if you look at, for instance, previous attempts to, let's say, for instance, compete in search. So there was, I forget what the amount was, but a lot of money was invested into creating a European search engine.
A couple of them.
I don't know. And it never worked out. Why didn't it work out? Because again, these people were playing basically a sort of like innovation playbook that isn't real. Those are not the rules that the rest of the industry is playing by, right? The reason Google is dominant is very simple. They own Android, and they pushed Chrome, and they used Android to push Chrome everywhere. They use that as the default, and they pay massive amounts of money to Apple for iOS and to all browser vendors to be the default. That's it. They control the distribution channels by basically bribing everyone into defaulting into Google, right? And those are huge amounts, right? The amount they pay Apple annually is around $20 billion. So this is massive. If you think that you can come up, again, this is the Better Roads example, right? If you think you can come up with a wonderful search engine and it's just gonna like snap your fingers because it's better, it's gonna outcompete the rest through innovation, you've already lost, because you're not playing the sort of like mobster control of the entire town approach. So how do you break that? Well, part of it would be like by enforcing the DMA, which I'm still waiting for something to come out of that. But because you need to break those control points, but even that is not enough. A better way of solving the problem, or at least in addition to DMA enforcement, is to think in terms of, hang on, search is not a monolith. Right. Can we break it apart in ways that are meaningfully governable? Because if you start having like, imagine the European Commission runs a search engine. No one wants that, right? They don't want that. No one wants to do that. And you run immediately into the problems of like state sponsorship, like who decides the ranking, etc. So you don't want that. What you want is to introduce infrastructure and pluralism into the system. So if you break search into components, you have the crawling and indexing. That's one component, and that's very infrastructural. Nothing is ever fully neutral, but like you can get to something that is like debatably much more neutral than what happens on top, which is ranking. So if you have indexing of the content that's out there on the web and you do a good index, that is something that could be shared as infrastructure and governed collectively by multiple actors. And those actors could be in part state actors, in part industry who are relying on it to use it. And then on top of that, people can provide ranking services. And maybe a newspaper could provide a ranking service, like maybe you want to use the FT's ranking service, or maybe you want to use like a far-right ranking service because you want something different. It doesn't matter. What's important is to have pluralism at the relevance level, because we shouldn't have like only one entity deciding what's more relevant than anything else, right? And then on top of the ranking, you have user interfaces, and that might be, maybe someone does a cool voice search thing. Maybe someone does the traditional like 10 links on a super like simplified page thing. That way you can have a lot of innovation at the higher layers. But by breaking the search engine problem down into smaller chunks, you can really govern them in ways that policymakers understand, because they're the same infrastructural approaches to governance approaches to infrastructure that we've deployed for like water sanitation and energy grids and all that. And that is something, so that lower layer of infrastructure is really something where like public investment could help a lot get it off the ground. There are projects that are already working on that, and then start building up those ranking systems. And what's missing there in terms of intervention is more of a convening place, right, to say like, hey, there's actually political power, there's will to doing that. There's value in doing that also for AI, because AI needs those APIs to search things, and they shouldn't be like hitting always the same ones, right? So the ecosystem is there. It almost is only missing this sort of convening place, the idea that there is political will behind this. And so to link that to your question about like the Indian model, I'm not aware that India has done this work in search or social yet, but they've done it in commerce in a way that's extremely interesting with the Beacon protocol, which is an OTN that you mentioned earlier. And so to explain very briefly how Beacon and how OTNs work, is they're basically an abstract view over commercial transactions. And then you create specialized networks for specific types of commercial transactions. And so typical transactions are like online retail or ride hailing, for instance. So ride hailing has been, my understanding, very successful in India. And essentially you have this, because these are always two-sided markets, but instead of having like Uber or Lyft or whoever own the two-sided market and therefore, determine
all the terms on both sides.
All the terms on both sides, that you have to pay through the nose because they decided it's search, that the people working, driving the cars have terrible labor conditions and they have to like keep like playing into this system. Well, the people on both sides can actually control jointly that network. Or you can have a network that's a trust, or maybe like a local town hall, the city council or whatever can have a say over it or control it. Then, once we open these things up for governance, the governance models already exist, right? It's not like we're just inventing democracy today, right? And so then you can have a system that works much better for the drivers and works much better for the ride hailers. And again, you can reproduce that, and the India Stack people have. With ONDC in retail. Right. With retail, instead of having Amazon that's capturing all the value and taking all the data and then investing it to compete with its own sellers, and forces you to buy ads, to pay them to put you up in the ranking, and all the terrible things that they're doing. Instead of having that, well, you can again have this network that's optimized for retail, and like every retailer just exposes their own inventory and the delivery methods they support, etc., to the network, and you can use a multiplicity of products to access that. So maybe you're tech savvy, you're like the super or maybe you're this super shopper, and like you have this advanced thing that allows you to like optimize prices or whatever you want, right? Or you're like someone who hates tech, and you just know that sometimes you need to buy something on the internet, and you have this completely separate product. So this enables innovation, and it liberates a lot of like flow of money for the retailers. It lowers prices for people. So this is a big win. So that really the Indie-Stack interventions, definitely beckon for sure, have targeted this infrastructural power, right, and made it like work in the service of people instead of against.
Let me ask you a more philosophical question, because it reminds me of this thing we just discussed on the state power versus sort of democratic decentralized governance. It sounds to me, and many people sort of asked me before, what's the difference between sort of the EU regulators, the American approach of regulation, and the Chinese or the Indian, for example. And I guess the relationship that citizens have to the state, as defined by the political system that they're in, is the point of difference. So, for example, in America, you have the First Amendment, the Second Amendment. All these sort of laws are sort of designed to protect you from sort of state intervention.
Right.
You're free from the state, and that's why you have the right to bear arms, and so on and so forth. Whereas in Europe, you have sort of a more paternalistic approach to the state. And you can argue in China, it's sort of even on the other side of the spectrum, where you have extreme state intervention and much more intrusive sort of relationships that citizens have. And I guess my philosophical question to you, having worked on multi-stakeholder international web governance, how do we sort of reconcile these approaches to sovereignty? What is the answer to sort of bridging this understanding? What are the commonalities that people in China and India and Europe and America all want, where we can align? And I guess the reason I thought of this is because it seems like decentralized governance models are often unwieldy and slower, and there are trade-offs to be made.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of where I'm coming from. And it would be nice to hear what you think. Where are we headed, and how will we resolve this relationship that we have with?
I think I have two components to that question. The first is, I think you framed the European model in paternalistic terms, and I think to some degree that can be true, but I think that misses a component that I think is important in the European approach, which is essentially, if you think in terms of capabilities instead of rights, then you want something that's closer to the European approach. Right. What I mean by that is like really like in the Amartya Sen's, like since we're doing philosophy, like I'm going all the way in, right? Really in terms of like the capabilities approach is that if you have the right to vote, but the state doesn't have an obligation to like make voting easy, you end up with the American system where maybe you'll have to take a day off from your limited vacations and then travel 2 hours and stay 8 hours in line for the ability to vote, right? Because it's just a right, but there's no obligation to actually deliver, which is what the capabilities approach that with effective freedoms, and not just like theoretical freedoms, demands. And so that is something that needs a stronger, state intervention or public intervention of some kind. Here, I don't know what the laws are like in Belgium, but like in France, if you're somehow unable to vote because the city didn't provide the right infrastructure for it, you can actually take them to court.
Sure. Belgium, it's mandatory.
Well, so these models of governance governance are, I think, important to think of in terms of like delivering actual freedom to people. So that's one side of it. I think it's important to think of it in those terms because a lot of the time we tend to revert to the American framing that's all about rights, and rights can be extremely ineffective. And so building on that, I think in terms of figuring out a governance model that works transnationally for like all the countries with all their specificities and all their preferences in terms of how people want to govern themselves, we have to figure out how to define technical architectures that lend themselves to a multiplicity of governance models. Right. And that is challenging. But again, to return to something I was saying earlier about breaking the problem down into smaller components, I think that is really the approach to take to make that possible. So for instance, if you think of social media, again, social media it's a monolithic idea, right? And how would you define social media globally such that it can be governed both transnationally and also at local levels, and maybe not just state level, but regional level, right? You end up with uncomfortable things where this behemoth has huge power and like states try to prod it from the outside to be a little bit better, but it's not great. But if you break that into smaller components, so for instance, the way that the AT protocol works, where you have like a small thing that is just in charge of keeping your data and interacting with your identity, and you have another thing that's in charge of like relaying that content to the rest of the network, and another thing or a host of other things that are in charge of producing different feeds with different recommendations, then it becomes a lot easier because the governance model for these individual components is simpler. They work together because you've defined an interoperable protocol that integrates them. But it means that if you want to have specific laws where it's illegal to host certain types of content, I don't mean just CSAM, but like other things, like maybe, for instance, in Germany, it might pirated content or Nazi symbolism or anything like that. Well, you can just like have that governance over that small part of the entire ecosystem that is like used by your citizens and is in your jurisdiction, and then the other things can be governed separately, and it makes it a lot easier to develop governance models that we understand. And one thing that I think is important there, there's a lot of European expertise in having this kind of subsidiarity, decentralized governance model.
I would say that you're sort of segueing into the end of this podcast, which is that we are actually, we wrote this paper called The European Way, right? And I think that is fundamentally what Europe is. Yeah. It's this decentralized collection of different stakeholders and ideas and interests coming together for a democratic purpose, to bring peace, to bring efficiency, but also I think subsidiarity is sort of
It's key. It's key. I mean, really, my vision for a future of technology, and I really think we can get there, is that we could have European technology that people want to be on in the same way that people want the European lifestyle. As really as a soft power play, it's just like, come use our stuff because it's 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 relaxed, it's democratic. You have a say. You have actual enforced, like capabilities instead of theoretical rights. And yeah, I think the European governance model, for all that we complain about it, subsidiarity is key because it means that it's not some random Silicon Valley product manager who's deciding how you live and how you use social media or search or whatever. It's you. It's at your level. It's something that can be delegated here. And experimentalism is also like key part of European governance. Like maybe some water authority somewhere in some region has this great new idea of how to I don't even understand how it works, like reverse osmosis, something, a new thing. They are allowed to experiment with that. And if it works, so long as they stay within certain safety parameters, then they can
take the learnings and bring it to 27 other countries.
Exactly. And so, yeah. Not just 27, it can be regional, right? It can be much more local than that. And so these are great models to bring to tech. And I really think if we succeed in bringing these governance models to tech, we'll have tech that people really want to use and really want to use not just in Europe.
So I guess we wrote, along with a bunch of academics, this sort of manifesto for the EU Commission. And we're calling it the European Way. And it's sort of a great sort of segue to our previous discussion on why this is important, then I think, could you tell us a bit more about what are the principles that sort of define this European way in your mind, in a sense, but also, just not to put you on the spot, but just to see, why do we need this European way to be adopted by the next Commission? What is your key top 2 or 3 pieces of advice for policymakers?
Right. I think, in my mind, the central point I would make with respect to that is really something that I'm a technologist. I spend a lot of time with tech people, but I also spend a lot of time explaining tech and talking tech, to policy people. And what I'm seeing, sort of like crossing back and forth between these two communities, is that on the policy side, people are really, they sense that there's a moment that something needs to be done, but they feel a lot of the time that they don't know what to do. There's a sense of like, we need a solution, we need something change. There's this notion of interregnum that Gramsci talks about, when we all know that the old system is dead, but the new system hasn't been born yet, and so
the transition
period, and I think everyone can sense that we're in that. And so on the policy side, it's very much, we know that something must be done, we want to do something, we don't know what. And talking to technologists, people have a ton of ideas, and practical ideas, like not pie in the sky stuff, things that could be scaled, could be implemented, but they don't sense the political will for it, and they don't know who to talk to. And so I think the most important thing, and in my mind that's something that the production of the paper, The European Way, already started to do, is to put these people in the same room and go like, okay, technologist, what solutions do you see in this space? How would you build it? And then explain it to policymakers in the way that, and I've had this experience several times, again, if you break down the problem into something manageable, and you start going like, what institution would you build there? Like policymakers, we know this. We've done this a million times before, right? And so when you start really creating that bridge, that collective approach, then you can really, I think there's this strong potential to deliver things. So I would focus on basically this convening of policymakers and technologists together. And I think the way of organizing it is we've had multiple papers, the Eurostack, the European Way, that look at sort of like an overarching strategy. And those are important, of course, but now we need some more focused work. And that's where technologists also have more to bring. And so we should have I don't know if it's a working group or a consortium or whatever, maybe for AI, we need an Airbus style approach. I think that would make sense for that segment. But for search, we need, something different. The fact is we need to start convening these. It's already happening a bit in social. So I'm also I'm a custodian of the Free Our Feeds initiative that is pushing for public interest social media infrastructure in Europe. And we're talking to Norway, we're talking to a number of people who want to make that happen. So that is starting to coalesce, but we need to do that for, cloud and browsers and app stores, exactly, across the stack. And so what I would really like to see from policymakers, and I'm sorry to say that the Commission has been particularly absent of all of these discussions, and I would really love to see that change, but is basically, create this convening space where people understand that there's political will and can bring solutions that they can debate together.
All right. So on that note, thank you. I hope that we will have a lot of digital Airbuses in the future on each layer of the stack. And on that sort of optimistic note, I really want to say thank you again. And it was great to have you here, and we will have you back.
Thanks. Wonderful conversation. Thank you very much.
Robin's definition of digital sovereignty is one that I think is very useful in terms of thinking about this question of digital sovereignty and why it is a growing concern in Europe and across the world. And that right now, infrastructure is in many cases monopolized by 1, 2, or 3 companies, and that these companies in turn have outsized influence over the governance of those infrastructures. But maybe just to then come back to the other question that you discussed quite a bit with Robin is really this question of the tech stack and thinking holistically about digital infrastructure and thinking about the different layers in the tech stack as all being part of digital infrastructures. It's not only hard infrastructure that is infrastructure, but things like digital ID, even the platforms that we use on a daily basis, the office software that we use, all of this is part of digital infrastructure. How do you think the tech stack can be a useful analytical tool for thinking about the EU's international partnerships?
So the tech stack is extremely useful for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that it brings granularity to the discussions. So if the Europeans, for example, have a concern on a certain layer of the tech stack, let's take an example, maybe semiconductors, you can see that Europe is in a relatively good position looking at the semiconductor value chain, and you will see that there are clearly choke points where Europe can exercise control. The question on that layer of the stack is how should the European companies sort of work together and increase their bargaining power in the whole value chain. That's a very different kind of problem to solve than, for example, if you go higher up the stack and you look at apps or digital platforms. And here, as we discussed and as Robin mentioned in his interview, these typical applications or these softwares or however you want to call them, they're also infrastructure. And he mentions they're the infrastructure of infrastructures to some extent, given that a lot of the other sort of traditional sectors rely on these platforms to do sector-specific work or specific things. And I think that really is super important. Like, we need to figure out solutions that are not sort of one size fit all, but solutions that are much more strategic and much more reflecting of the reality of Europe's position on each layer of the stack. So that's one reason why this is useful. Another reason why this is useful is because it then gives a common sort of language or framework for Europe to go discuss policy with other countries. So when Europe goes to Brazil or when Europe goes to India, they have the same sort of map that they can look at and say, okay, so the Indians want to do, let's say, semiconductor manufacturing or improve their manufacturing base, whereas Europe needs to ensure that they have some sort of spare capacity or to friendshore some of the lower tech chips. And in this case, there's a clear synergy between India and Europe's objectives. And having the stack framework really helps identify those areas of alignment, but it also reminds European policymakers to not do the digital policy in isolation and not to do it just focused on the internal requirements, but also making sure that whatever internal policies there are will have external ramifications, just given how interconnected the global digital supply chain is.
Yeah, I think this is a question we'll be delving into a lot more in the coming months, how to use the stack as an analytical lens, how to think about the EU's partnerships with different global partners from India to Brazil, African Union, Japan.
It's going to be a fascinating journey on this podcast series, but it is very timely and it is a thing that all countries are thinking about. So we're looking forward to that discussion.